However, it is true, I think, that the globalization we're experiencing today is fundamentally different from the globalization of these first 2 or 3 decades after World War II. And I want to talk about the differences. Now, by globalization, I assume you all have a definition in your own mind, but let me just tell you what my definition is so we're basically dealing from the same page. To me, globalization is the process of the integration of national economies in terms of the flow of goods and services across borders, the flow of people, the flow of information, ideas, and money. So it's the flow of all these things across borders, and to some extent the flow of culture. But that is really a side effect of the flow of these other things. When you're talking about economic globalization, it's goods, services, money, information, ideas, that sort of thing. Now, there are in my view, there are 3 fundamental differences between what I will call globalization 2, which is what has happened really since the earlier mid-1980s up until now, and if you contrast that with what happened in the earlier post-war decades. There are 3 differences between globalization 1 and globalization 2. The first, and I think probably the most important difference, is that the membership in the global economy has expanded enormously. What we called the world economy in the 70s and early 80s was really not the world economy. It was the United States trading with its closest allies. The United States trading with Europe, Western Europe, not Eastern Europe. The United States trading with Japan, Australia, Canada, and a few other countries. But basically, this was an American-centered system, and the participants in it were America's geopolitical allies. And huge parts of the world were excluded, usually by their own choice. If you look to see who was not participating in the world economy at that time, the entire Soviet bloc, Soviet Union and all its Eastern European satellites, which they had their own trading system. It was called Comecon. And they had slight trading relationships with the West, but only for things they absolutely needed. So, and their trading was essentially self-contained. China was attempting to be self-sufficient. They were not involved in the world economy. They only imported the things they absolutely needed, which were usually food in periods of poor harvests. But the Chinese essentially had few, if any, relations with the broader world economy. India was essentially outside the world economy. They had a socialized economic system, highly regulated, highly protectionist. They were not really interested in much trade with the outside world. And Africa was mainly outside the world economy, mostly because they were just too poor. They had nothing to sell, and they couldn't afford anything to buy. So when you add all those groups up, you're basically talking about half the world's population in the early 1970s that's not part of the world economy. Now, obviously, that's not true anymore. The Chinese are hugely engaged in the world economy today. So are the Indians. The former Soviet Union and most of its satellites are now active trading partners with the rest of the world. Even Africa has now begun to enter into the mainstream of global commerce. So what we call the world economy today is, I would say, fundamentally different from what we thought of the world economy in the 70s, 60s, and even the early 1980s. Now, the second major difference in today's globalized economy, and again, the pre-1980 or 85 version of it, is that there are massive capital flows among nations. Now, when people talk about capital flows, they're just talking about the movement of money. You're just talking about money moving in and out of countries. To give you just one idea of the massive amounts of these international capital flows, in 2007, there was a record $1 trillion worth of capital inflows into developing countries like China, Brazil, Singapore, whatever. Huge amount of money. And that's just one indicator of the massive amounts of international capital flows. Now, why is this different from what we had pre-1980? After World War II, most countries had capital controls. Capital controls are basically laws and regulations that say to a country's citizens that you can or cannot move your money abroad. And also say to businesses and citizens in the country, you cannot accept money from abroad. In other words, if somebody wants to buy your stocks or bonds, if somebody wanted to buy the French stocks or bonds in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s, it was very difficult for foreigners to do that. If the French wanted to invest outside of France, it was very difficult for them to do that because there were laws against doing it. And obviously these things are very technical, very complicated, but almost all countries, a major exception was the United States, had very comprehensive capital controls that essentially said to people, your savings will be invested at home here. And the trading on our stock exchanges will basically be among nationals, your fellow citizens. And the money our national money essentially will be regulated by our central bank. Central bank of the United States is the Federal Reserve, and every major country has a central bank. And before, in France, it's the Banque de France. In England, it's the Bank of England, etc. And your national money will be regulated by your central bank because the money can't flow abroad very easily. All this changed in part, and the explanation is in here, in part because inflation came down in the United States, and the United States was sending massive amounts of dollars abroad, and people had to figure out what to do with these dollars, and that tended to break down these barriers. And people became convinced that allowing inward investment, receiving investment from other countries was a good thing. So gradually these capital controls were dismantled. Again, it was a very slow, technical, and tedious process, understood in its details mainly by the technicians who managed it. But the consequences of this were enormous and are only now becoming appreciated. Essentially, we have created a global financial system, whereas 30 or 40 years ago, the global financial system was very limited, and you mostly had national financial systems. The third change, I think, is just the extent and the nature of international economic interdependence. Even in the 1970s, the trading that was occurring was mainly the kind of trading you would expect to find based on economics textbooks. In other words, it was comparative advantage. Countries exported the things in which they had a comparative advantage and imported the things in which they didn't have a comparative advantage. So the United States, for example, tended to export agricultural goods because we're a low-cost producer of corn and wheat and soybeans. We tended to export very sophisticated capital machinery, aircraft, computers, machines that make other machines, machinery used in factories, because, again, we had the technical capability and a comparative advantage in that. We tended to import consumer goods and manufactured goods that were labor-intensive because our labor was expensive and other countries' labor was relatively cheap. So we imported lots of shoes, we imported toys, we imported clothes, and we imported increasingly consumer electronics where the labor content was also high because of the assembly costs. So that's the kind of trade that existed in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. Today you see not only greater amounts of trade in relationship to our economy, and let me just give you a couple of statistics here. In 1980, exports and imports were about 10% of our gross domestic product, which is a measure of our economy. Today, imports are roughly 17%. So they've gone up, relatively speaking, 70% since 1980. But it's not just the magnitude of trade flows that's changed here. It's the nature of them. Many products now involve global supply chains where you don't have something that is simply made in the United States or made in Germany or made in Japan. These products are made all over the world and they're assembled someplace, but they consist of components and inputs that come from many countries. So we have these huge global supply chains, and the interdependencies among countries have now become a lot more complicated.